have to continue. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, because it's turn for me to talk about some new piece of research. So it's going to be an interesting story, as I hope, about Spain, well, in particular about Catalonia, where in 2020 rent control of the type of rental brake or Mietpreisbremse, German Mietpreisbremse, was introduced, and then 2 years later it was revoked. Thank you very much. That's a joint work with 3 colleagues from Spain: Fernando Lopez, David Rey Blanco, and Pelayo González Arbues. The last 2 of them are from Idealista, which is an internet portal for advertisements on real estate. And I hope that at least some of my authors is online. I don't know, if you give some sign, it will be very nice. So the why rent control was introduced? Well, we have been talking about rent control the whole this workshop, and apparently there are some reasons for this also in Catalonia, and some of them were mentioned during this workshop, also outside of the official sessions. I'll just put one argument that possibly contributed to this discussion and motivated the introduction of rent control. So here I show the rental burden in selected cities in Catalonia. Rental burden being measured as proportion of housing, or in this case, rental costs in the total budget of the household. Here I use the data from there, which is the cost of living webpage. And we can see that rental burden is particularly high in Barcelona and neighboring towns, and it lies somewhere between 30 and 40%. It doesn't achieve 40%, but it's above 30%. So that was one of the reasons to, as I think, to introduce rent control in Catalonia. And interestingly, at the same time, Spain introduced a rent moratorium, which was related to COVID, and was there 2 years between 2020 and 2022. And then on top of this, Catalonia introduced its own rent control. The first attempt, by the way, was already in 2019, but then it was not ratified by the parliament, and I don't know if it really was really in power or not. More interesting and more long-lived attempt was undertaken in September 2020. In October 2020, the law was enacted, and it was revoked, I think, in March of this year. So it had a short but interesting life. And I'd like to claim that this rent control introduced in Catalonia falls into the family, as you wish, of Mietpreisbremse. So Mietpreisbremse is a kind of father. Then the older brother is the Loi Elan in France. And as we learned today, there's a younger brother in Brussels. So now the family is getting bigger and bigger. But in each family, you have members of the family which are somewhat similar, somewhat different from others. So in Catalonia has many properties that it shares Catalonian law with German and French laws, and some of the properties are different. So, for example, unlike Germany and France, where the rent control was initially introduced for 5 years, in Spain there was no final period. The legislation was indefinite. We all know that after the first 5 years come typically other 5 years and another 5 years. But in Spain, from the very beginning, they were aware of it and introduced the indefinite horizon. The second feature, which is common to all these regulations, is that, to all these rental brake regulations, is that they don't cover the entirety of the country, but they just focus on particular municipalities, typically municipalities with dense housing market. Interestingly, in Germany, we have about more than 300 municipalities out of 10, almost 11,000 municipalities, with a total population of 25%. In France, even less, 7% of population live under this rental break. But in Catalonia, it's more than 2/3 of population that were covered by the rent control. So the majority of population was subject to rent control. Then, like in German regulation, in Catalanian regulation, there were exceptions for newly built and largely renovated buildings. And more interestingly, there was exception for big dwellings, the dwellings with a floor size of more than 150 square meters. Maybe Anna can tell us something about this in more detail. This exception, however, was not really exception in terms of as we know from German experience. In Germany, in Berlin, in this case, if the dwelling was completed after October, well, actually after January 2014, then it was there were no limits on the rent set in this for this dwelling. In Spain, there were limits, but they were a little bit more generous than for other dwellings. And well, finally, in all these three regulations and possibly in Brussels ones, there are limits. And that's the essence of this legislation. There are limits put on the rents, so there are upper bounds. In Germany, these are 10%, so you have typically paid rent in this neighborhood, and you add 10%. That's the upper limit for rent setting at the beginning of the contract. In France, even more, 20%, but in Spain, they had the lowest bound of 5%. Okay. And so we started to research the possible consequences of this rental break in Spain about 1 year ago, and we hope to be the first. But unfortunately, we were too lazy, and at the end of the day, we are happening to be the second ones in this race. So the first paper, to my disappointment, was written not by me, but by Monras and Montalvo, two colleagues from Catalonia. So they investigated and found two types of effects, price effects. They found that the rent control in Catalonia led to a rental price decrease of 5%. And half of this decrease was due to the change in the composition, meaning that more cheaper dwellings were offered on the market after the introduction of the rent control. And they also found negative supply effects. So less dwellings were supplied at the market after the rent control was introduced in Catalonia. Now, we use a bit different data than Monras and Montalvo, and here I would like to show the differences and also stress possible advantages of our research. They use the data of Incasol, which stands for Institut Català del Sol, so the real estate institute, which is the official entity collecting data on transaction rents, so the rents that are being actually paid. We use the data from Idealista, from a portal with real estate announcements, and of course, in this case, we are using the asking prices. The time periods partly coincide. They begin 1 year. I mean, Monras and Montalvo begin 1 year earlier, and the sample 1 year earlier too than we do. So we start in 2017 and stop in May 2020, which gives us an enormous advantage because we can not only investigate the consequences of the introduction, but also the revocation of this regulation. We also have many more characteristics than the data used by Monraz and Montalvo. The sample sizes are comparable. They use 500,000 enhancements, not enhancements, but data points, observations. We use 400, about 400 for rental units and 600 for units for sale. And this leads me to the second advantage of our study. Unlike Monraz and Montalvo, we're not only using rental segment, but we'll also take into account the sales segment. So we look at what happens to the sales prices and the volumes. Typically, in this kind of studies, you are using the so-called difference and differences approach, which means that you try to select two groups. One is the treatment group, the group which is subject to regulations, and another group is the control group, which is not subject to regulations. Ideally, you would have exactly the same objects in both groups, with the only difference being the ones are treated, the other ones are not. So ideally, we would have exactly the same dwellings with exactly the same characteristics in exactly the same place, but unfortunately, it's not the life. So in the life, the regulation covers all dwellings in the same municipality. Okay, so by the way, these red-colored municipalities are the 60 municipalities that are subject to rent control, and all dwellings here we treat as members of the treatment group. And you see that they are mostly concentrated around Barcelona on the seashore, and there are a couple, I think it's Lleida, in the interior of the country. So the approach, as far as understood, of Monraz and Montalvo was to take all other dwellings located in non-regulated municipalities as the control group. We also take this approach, but we make an additional assumption, or additional restriction. We use on not only all these dwellings, but also we separately consider the dwellings located in the neighboring municipalities, meaning municipalities that are not subject to control, but that share a common border with the control municipalities. Okay, so we hope that this makes them a little bit more similar to the treatment group dwellings. And we use here, as I said, two time effects. We consider both enactment of the regulation and its revocation in March this year. Plus, we also take into account the possible effects of COVID. We use here the Oxford Stringency Index, which measures the intensity of different sanitary measures, such as lockdowns, wearing of masks, closing of schools, and so on and so forth. So this allows us to measure the effect, both to measure the effect of COVID and to a certain extent to measure the effect of national regulation, of the rent moratorium introduced in whole Spain that I mentioned before. Because it actually, the first law that introduced the rent moratorium was enacted in March 2020, exactly at the same time when the first lockdown measures started to be introduced. Okay. And a few words about control and treatment groups. So here I compare different characteristics, in particular 16 characteristics of rental dwellings, control and treatment groups, and here dwellings for sale. The two pictures are very similar, so I will only talk about this one. So here we have the intensity of different characteristics on the axis, and the red line is the treatment group, while dark gray line corresponds to the uncontrolled municipalities which have a common border with controlled ones, and light gray line corresponds to all other dwellings located in unregulated municipalities. And these are the average numbers. So what I can see, but you cannot, but I will explain. So what are the big differences between the control and treatment groups? Well, the dwellings in the treatment group, they are much older. They also are much closer to the city center of Barcelona. They are located in municipalities with much higher population density. They are more likely to be sold by a real estate agent, but in general, in these idealista apartments, the vast majority of dwellings are sold or rented out by agents, not by the owners themselves. They also are more likely to be located in bigger houses, with more floors and more apartments. And they are less likely to have parking space because of their location in the crowded areas. And they are also slightly more likely to have a lift, but looking at the size of the dwellings, they are not very different from the control groups. And one important thing to mention here is that this our smaller control group, which includes only dwellings located in the neighbor unregulated municipalities, is not really very similar to the treatment group, which is, of course, a big disadvantage. But we hope through use of so-called hedonic approach to somehow address the differences in characteristics between treatment and control. Okay, so what we did was to look at the development of prices here and quantities. So here I can see the rental market, and here I'm using the microdata, so the data at dwelling level, taking into account all the characteristics of these dwellings and some time changes, while here we concentrate on aggregated data. So we aggregate data both at weekly frequency and at municipal level. So these are the average weekly numbers of announcements, of rental announcements per municipality. What we see here is that this is the period of the rent control in Catalonia. So after introduction of rent control, there was a decline in prices of controlled dwellings and also a slight decline, but not statistically significant decline in the prices of unregulated dwellings. So this is basically typical what would we expect and what we find in the literature. In terms of rental housing supply, we see that there was a certain decline in the supply, but not very big. So the quantity effects are quite weak, negative but weak. Now we look at the sales market. Here again we have prices. These are selling prices, and the quantities. These are dwellings offered for sale. So here we almost don't see any effect for regulated dwellings, but for regulated dwellings we see a slight increase in the selling prices, which is also a kind of consequence that we would expect, because people are demanding, they cannot find more dwellings regulated sector, and therefore they started to demand more unregulated dwellings, and therefore their price increases. In terms of supply, we see that the supply of both regulated and unregulated dwellings for sale increased after the introduction of rent control, which is also a kind of expected effect. To summarize, before summarizing, I forgot to mention that I also looked at the effect on housing construction. So here I use the monthly averages of housing starts. In Spain, you have both housing starts and housing completions. Typically, you have the lag between decision to build and housing completion is very long. It can be 2 years or even more. The lag between decision to construct and housing start is much shorter. Therefore, it's more interesting to consider it in the context of these reforms. So what we have here are different regions. Here we have Spain in total, Comunidad de Madrid, which is an analog of federal state or Bundesland in Germany. Catalonia, also another analog of federal state. In Barcelona, in this case, not the city, but not the municipality, but the province, because I couldn't find data at the municipal level. And here we have average monthly housing starts immediately prior to the introduction of rent control, so until September 2020. And here during the rent control, so from October 2020 till March 2022. So what we see for Spain and Comunidad de Madrid, when we compare these figures, then we see that there's an increase of 12%. After introduction of rent control in Catalonia only, there was an increase in the number of housing starts in Spain overall and in Comunidad de Madrid too. If you look at Comunidad Autónoma Catalonia, or federal state of Catalonia, then we see a decline over the same period of 6% and even more for the province of Barcelona, 7%, which is not a proof, of course. It can be a spurious result, and I should acknowledge that there are 4 provinces. Well, that's not that I'm going to acknowledge. Everybody knows it. So there are 4 provinces in Catalonia, but what I would like to acknowledge is that not for all of them we have a decrease in the number of housing starts, to be honest. Okay, but at least for the whole country, for the whole federal state, there's a decrease, and we also have to take into account that not all the municipalities were subject to the control. Therefore, this effect can probably underestimate the total effect. So if there's an increase in housing starts in unregulated areas and decrease in regulated, then that's the average number, which is might be slightly less than the decrease in the regulated areas, but we don't have data for municipalities. Maybe we have, but or somebody has, but I'm not aware of this. And well, here I come to the last slide, just a kind of recapitulation, a bit difficult to swallow, I should admit. But anyway, so here I showed 8 effects that we considered in this study. So we have rental dwellings here and dwellings for sale here. We have introduction and revocation, we have regulated and unregulated dwellings, and we have price and supply effects. Okay, so here I put the effects that we would expect based on common sense and on economic theory, and here are the effects that were found. So almost no effects for rental dwellings. Here I put zeros. In the graph you saw probably negative effects, but I'm talking here about statistically significant impacts. So from the statistical point of view, these are zeros. So no quantity effects. We would expect the supply to reduce, but from statistical point of view, I didn't find any evidence of decreases in the supply. On the price side, we see a negative effect of introduction for regulated dwellings and positive effect after revocation. Until now, it's quite reasonable. So for unregulated dwellings, I would say there's no effect after introduction, but interestingly, there's a big positive effect after revocation, meaning that after the rent control was revoked, was cancelled, the rents for unregulated dwellings, rental dwellings, went up dramatically. And considering the regulated dwellings or unregulated dwellings for sale, we see that For regulated, we have positive effects, both after introduction, after revocation. For unregulated, we have no supply side effects. And in both cases, we have some positive price effects, so or none or small positive price effects. For example, for regulated dwellings for sale, no effects after introduction, but small positive effects after revocation. And for unregulated dwellings, small positive effects after introduction and big positive effects after revocation. So they appear to, if I did everything correctly from the econometric point of view, then the effect is increase in prices of unregulated dwellings after revocation of the control. So we see some desired effects of the introduction, some rather undesired effects of the revocation, and therefore I'm a little bit ambiguous, or my results are a little bit ambiguous. So I'd like to probably to have a short discussion, or maybe longer discussion with you, so that together, my hope is that together we can make more sense of these results. Thank you very much.
I was wondering to what extent there were anticipation effects before the introduction of the law, because there was probably debated, and perhaps the introduction moment is perhaps not the best first cut.
Yeah, that's true, because we did similar exercise for Berlin, for Mittendeckel, for a much stricter form of rent control, and there we, in another paper, this one, and we also took into account the first announcement, which was 1 year before the measure was introduced, but at that time there were no statistical effects. I mean, we didn't find any strong statistical effects of the announcements. Plus, in Catalonia, there was one kind of announcement. I could have taken this into account. It's not an announcement, it's the first attempt to introduce the same measure in 2019, that failed almost immediately. I don't know, maybe Anna can tell us if there was some campaign led in the media against or for this measure half a year ago before the introduction.
A year ago, I mean, before the implementation, they started talking about it, but it was very quickly, the implementation. So people really took it by surprise. And it was just after the lockdown, people were not able to do new contracts to the people that was still living in the rents, because there was a moratorium. And it is true, because I don't know how much the effect will be, but when the pandemic started, there was a huge amount of touristic apartments that went to the rental sector, no more rental sex. So the supply increased a lot. So we are still absorbing that supply, and it is not really 100% in the touristic area again. So I don't know how much of that effect is reflected in here, because we seen in some months of the pandemic that the rents were extremely low, but what we were what was normal in Barcelona. And it was because of that, because the supply of rents was super high for some months. And we still don't know how much of the effect is because of that or because of the rent control. We are not sure about it. It's difficult to quantify, but we still don't have the numbers of tourism that we had before the pandemic. So we think that there are still that kind of apartments in the long-term contracts until these normalized. And you ask?
Can you get Airbnb data to quantify that?
Yes, but we don't only use Airbnb. So there are a lot of agencies that manage these apartments. So it's just not Airbnb. You can use Airbnb. It's not that. And you you asked me, I reply about the 150 square meters. That was the exception for the rent control. Actually, this was a choice of each municipality, and almost all of them included. I mean, taking in consideration that in Spain the houses are not really big, because especially in the cities which are the dense areas, it was really a controversial, because 150 square meters apartments are luxury apartments or houses, and those are not. It really does have no sense to rent control luxury apartments. So it was like, okay, we have to rent control Messi's house. It has just no sense. And almost all municipalities that ask for being a dense area, they included that. So it was.
So what is in the unregulated category here? It's only the new apartments, the newly built.
No, and really, I mean, in unregulated are those dwellings located in unregulated municipalities.
Okay. But then the comparison is okay.
Yeah, I should say that when preparing this presentation, I also tried to consider the apartments that are bigger than 150 meters and that are close to them, like 140 to 150. And honestly speaking, I didn't find any effects at all. So here I find at least some effects, but for this more accurately defined control group, I don't find any price or quantity effects of the regulation.
Yeah, just one question. In the beginning, you mentioned the decrease of supply of rental housing, and if I remember correctly from the Mietendeckel paper, there was a quite similar effect. And I'm wondering, where do these units go? I have some ideas. It cannot be construction for these short regulation times. So I'm wondering, are they going to the short-term rental market, or are they just being vacant? Do they go to a black market? Like, what do you think where these units go? Because they do not disappear.
Yeah, that's true. Well, honestly speaking, when we compare to the results obtained for Berlin, those effects were much stronger. So we had a decrease of 50%. It was difficult to oversee it. Here, the effect is very weak and statistically insignificant. But in general, and that's the second point, I think you can supply your explanation of this. The first thing that people do, I mean, the sellers do at the market when some uncertainty comes, they wait until more certainty appears, and during that time they stop transacting, and therefore the volume can decrease dramatically in some cases. After a certain period, after a certain month, they can decide what to do, to keep it vacant further, to sell it, or probably to rent under the conditions that exist in the market.
Or even black market,
higher rents. Yeah. This
unregistered.
What's your explanation?
I would think the same, like that they hesitate. They want to know also the rent. The Mietendeckel was very disputed. Many people said it's not constitutional, and I think they hesitate. And unfortunately, we didn't get to see what would happen long term, but I think that's what's happening most of the time.
In case of Catalonia, people already know that law was unconstitutional. So we were waiting for this to disappear.
That's the same thing in Germany. Even the Katrina Loscha, the so to speak, the mother of rent freeze, she from the very beginning she was warning that the Constitutional Court can decide against the regulation and that people have to gather money as the difference between the allowed rent and the actual and the market rent, so that if the law is revoked, people have enough money buffer to pay this rental debt. But as far as I know, in Spain, the Constitutional Court kept this regulation for the dwellings that for which the contracts were concluded during the validity of this rental break, which is somewhat strange. Typically, when you revoke the regulation, then all its provisions are also cancelled for the past contracts, but that wasn't the case in Spain. So for some contracts, this regulation is still valid.
The major problem was not the prices in the index that you can put in a new contract. The major problem was that if you do another contract and you had a previous one, you had to put the price of the previous one. And if that person was like 10 years living there and you had a price of the rent of 200 euros, the new contract has put 200 euros. So that was really the scandal of the rent control in Catalonia. Because there was a lot of people that just renewed contracts and increased. That was not possible at that time.
Okay, so thanks a lot for all the participants, both on and offline. I hope that you enjoyed this edition of the workshop, and it was also useful for all of us. And I hope that we can organize something similar next year, maybe not in Berlin, in some other place of the world. And I would like to invite you to participate in the next edition of it and share your good impressions with your colleagues, authors, friends, so that our community can grow further. Thank you very much.
Thank you.